Please welcome Wanling Martello and Ann Ziegler with Fortune's Editor-in-Chief, Cliff Leaf.
He ran away before I could shake his hand. And
all right.
Everything is
We're
good.
quick enough.
We're quick. All right. Normally we have a Q&A at the end, but I'm going to start with one important question. So if we could just actually raise the lights on the important partners in the audience. Okay. So most people think about boards as being involved in governance and oversight. I want to ask each of you, do you think your board primarily, and we won't look at any name, we won't take any names, is primarily involved in governance and oversight, or primarily involved in leading change, in seeing around corners and helping you navigate that change? So first, how many people think that their boards are primarily involved in governance and oversight? Let's see a show of hands. All right, I see some familiar faces out there. And then how many think that they are really primarily involved in leading change? Oh, there's a handful. Now, as John mentioned to me, he said, now, what would you say after you'd had a drink and privately tell us the answers? And so we should look at that. But I suspect that many of you who actually are managing companies would probably prefer your board just to stay out of your way anyway, as we joked about. But you want them to provide the environment for constructive change. John, you and I were talking about that earlier. What does that mean?
Well, I think it's been a huge fundamental change in the last 10 years. Every company, 40% of the companies in this room won't exist in 10 years, and if you're a startup, 70% of you will not exist. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden, a company has to get market transitions right with big data, mm-hmm. AI, digitization. They have to move at 3 times, maybe 5 times the speed that occurred just a decade ago. They have to reinvent themselves, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And so I think the role of the board has changed. The role of the board can, if you talk to many CEOs, especially looking back 5 or 10 years or further, is to hire and fire the CEO and candidly to represent the investors to make sure the strategy is well thought out. I think those days are gone forever. I think you're now looking at where if you're going to lose 40% of the companies within a decade, the board mm-hmm. has to be more involved, not doing management's jobs, but creating the environment to take the risk, supportive mm-hmm. of the CEO when she or he takes that risk, but also very firm. You miss it by 2 to 3 years, mm-hmm. you miss it forever. Data for you, how long did it take Walmart to get passed by Amazon and market cap? 21 years, and I was on the Walmart board. We saw them coming. How long did it take Tesla to pass GM and Ford? Mm-hmm. 14 years. How long did it take Uber to pass Tesla? 7 years. Next series of changes are 3 to 5 years. So the speed and how you combine technology with business model change is everything. The boards have to be more diverse, and they have to be a lot more gender inclusive as well, especially as it regards to age.
So Wanling, you're on one of those boards, Uber, you're also on Alibaba Group board. When we think about the challenges today that boards face, it's, company reputations can change in an instant, and you are now front and center in having those conversations. So it's not just hire and fire, but you're actually dealing with damage control as much as anything else.
Yeah, it's really interesting, whether you talk about Uber or Alibaba, because the speed and scale of change is just amazing. It's yes. sort of like, especially if you see what's happening in China. Mm-hmm. And what has made me realize being on the Uber board is it's so important, the trust factor amongst the board members, first and foremost. Sort of like as we come together as a team mm-hmm. to help the company get out of any crises, we have to know how to work with each other. We have to trust each other, which is, which is not something that you take for granted, especially for a board of a relatively new company. And so it was interesting to be part of it.
Now, just to follow up, so you're also on the board of one of Nestle's companies. I know you're obviously the CEO of the Asia, Oceania, Nestle version. We wrote a fascinating story. Erica Fry wrote it about Maggi noodles, which was a little instant noodle pack. And overnight, it essentially created a crisis in one of the largest, markets for that brand.
Yeah.
So how do you, you got to, it's an all call at that moment, right? Everybody gets involved in trying to.
No, absolutely. It was interesting because I had just taken over the job as the CEO of the region.
Right.
And just as I took over, the India Maggi noodle crisis hit. I swear I thought it was a conspiracy going on. 400 million of my business evaporated overnight. And it was not a question of our products being bad.
Right.
It was a question of testing protocol. And so for a company that has existed in India for over 100 years, and our company as a group been around for 150 years, I was amazed at how we were caught flat-footed, not knowing sort of like where to go, and navigating through that. In India was, somebody told me, in India it was Maggi noodle, cricket, and Bollywood were like the three most important things. And so how do you navigate that? So it's knowing the right people and really, in the end, being authentic about what's happening to the company and what's going on was really helpful.
Now, before I get to the end, just let me follow up. I mean, was your board helpful in this? Did you get some guidance? We're off the record.
Yeah, we're off the record.
Now, let me save her. If she works on a lot of boards, reverse that. Because when you're receiving from your board, the last thing you can stand up here in front of the group and say no or just partially.
Of course.
But you were on two of the toughest boards. I thought you all made a lot of difference in helping both those companies through it. And that's actually probably a question you can be even more transparent on.
I mean, different people on the board brought different sort of like different levels of help. Yeah. But and we're also publicly listed in India, so it's not just the Nestle SA board in Switzerland, but also in India. Okay. Yeah. And being part of management, it's also being very specific when you go to the board on this is where I need help on.
Right.
Yes.
To just say I'm in a crisis, help me doesn't really help you get anywhere.
Now, big companies, small companies, startups, mature incumbents, they're all different. You, Anne, you've been on Groupon's board, on Wolters Kluwer, the academic publisher. You're on Hanes Brands, which is an old brand. Mm-hmm. What is the difference that you begin with? What is the tone change between those two worlds?
Yeah, well, a couple of things. I'm on a venture capital board, Revolution Foods, as well as much more established companies, and I spent 10 years at CDW, which at the beginning of that was owned by private equity, so a private board, right? The startups move much more quickly. They can because they don't have a history, right, or processes in place or biases in place as to how things can and should be done. In most cases, startups, they're not profitable, right? So they have to move quickly. John, you talked about the environment for innovation. There's nothing like an external crisis, right, to create an environment that permits and accelerates change, makes people open to change. So you have a startup that's not profitable, that organization and that board's going to be very willing and interested in trying new things, right, to get where you need to be. Similar example was during the financial crisis when I was the CFO of CDW. There's nothing like 10 times leverage and 1 times interest coverage, right, to get the company, the board, the culture, right, very focused on change and be very willing to adapt to change because you need to change if you're going to survive. Now that's true of a lot of companies today, actually, given the stats that John that you threw out. But an external crisis can really create that environment where everybody is on board and focused on driving change. At times, a very successful existing company may be less open to change because, all the lights are green on the dashboard, right? That's the environment where I think a board can be really helpful about being forward-looking, right? And helping to make sure the organization stays focused on innovation and change.
So John and Wan-Ling, I'd love actually both of you to jump on this too, because it really is a difference in involvement, in vision, and in engagement between a startup and a board versus an older company and a board. Talk a little bit about how when to kind of clamp down on your vision thing and let the management do it.
I'm not really sure, Cliff, that there is a big difference because I would argue that in a big company like Nestle, 150 years old, the need to change and the need to get sort of like up to speed in terms of all the disruption can even be more acute.
Right.
And so because you've got systems and processes, the way we look at things, very entrenched in the company's culture, and how do you, as a board member, help the company develop a culture
Yeah.
that will be more agile and be more,
That's a good
move
point.
faster.
Yeah.
But I think the key takeaway is that, and we're in agreement on this, large companies have to behave like startups in today's world. If you don't, you're going to be roadkill. Second key takeaway, you've got to reinvent yourself with tremendous speed around the technology changes as every company in this room becomes a technology company, a digital company, and yet many boards really are even wrestling with what does digitization mean to me? How do I innovate at a different speed? You combine that with most of the real brilliant young people that are coming out of school are now going into startups. Doesn't matter if you're in France, doesn't matter West Coast, East Coast, or India, they're going there. So if you're wanting to innovate as a large company, you've got to find a way to work with startups in a way that you haven't before. And you've got to have a board that doesn't do the management's jobs, but it says, what is your strategy to get there? I want to know your playbook, both in terms of how you're doing with market transitions, your playbook on innovation, your playbooks on culture, how you're going to reinvent yourself, and who are your competitors of the future, not of the past, and the transitions you're going to win and lose on, and who you're disrupting. And if you don't have somebody you're disrupting, you're getting disrupted. So that's the role of the board. It used to be just let's represent the investors and let's change the CEO or evolve the CEO. Today, the role of the board has to be, have you really thought through this tremendous speed of innovation and disruptions about to hit you? And realize you're not going to grow headcount anymore. Probably, if you're a big company, your competitors, a small company has been out there 3 to 4 years, and they can displace you in 3 to 4 years. It's a whole different mentality on it. And I think both large and companies have to think like startups.
I agree.
Yeah.
You know, the one thing though, John, I would caution is because I often hear this from people within the company or outside. Or you mentioned twice diversity in terms of age.
Yes.
And I would say that
and gender.
people, but people cannot relegate sort of like this innovative thinking to to the younger generation, because I sit on the Ali board, and Jack Ma is 54. He just turned 54, and he's one of the most innovative.
I've known him for 30 years.
Right? And so to me, I always, because oftentimes people say, we need to hire younger people. No, wait. It's like you can't just like relegate the whole thing.
You can't, but what you have to do is create that environment from the board saying you must have large diversity in age and also in terms of capability.
I agree.
The average CEO, I'm into 16 startups and having the time of my life, and I advise another 40 of them. But the average CEO age is 32 years of age. And if you help them scale within two years, they'll be as good as a 50-year-old or the 70-year-old. And so it's how do you get the best of both worlds? How do you get a board that has seasoned people that have seen the movie before, but others will say you're about to be disrupted? There's no industry being more disrupted than your CDW in terms of how quickly and that changed the models.
Right, technology. And I think when you're in a technology company, you're very used to change and you understand. I used to say that, the only thing constant about the technology that CDW does is it's constantly changing. And so that I think in a company like CDW, because it's technology, you have a change and adapt quickly mindset. I think it's potentially other companies where technology was never a driver of business performance, right? It was something that you did, it was a tool, but it wasn't a driver of business performance the way it has become today. I think there is where you really have to focus on. One of the things you said is, who are your competitors? It's who are your competitors going to be 3, 4, 5 years from now?
And the key point that Ann and Wen-Ling just both said is that it used to be a technology company or a digital company, but that was technology within silos. You're now talking about business model change, and as you go digital, you wipe out the silos. You focus on outcomes. So you're talking about changing culture, you're talking about changing organization structure, you're talking about digitizing when the majority of the people often in that company aren't even active in social media in many of these companies, and you're talking about tremendous transformational change, and then interfacing to startups knowing that the majority of the startups you face to are going to fail. So how do you think about it differently than you did before?
So we have a lot of expertise and the spirit of reinvention in this audience. I would love to be able to open up this for questions. So think about that and then let your paddler know, and we'll get a question over to you, a mic over to you. While we're waiting for that, what's the biggest mistake that boards make?
Doing the right thing too long. It's how I was trained in MBA school and how we're still training them today. Just 3 to 5% better every year, cranking like you did before, and that's the key to failure.
And what's the biggest mistake you made as a board member?
This will shock you. I get criticized for being too aggressive, dreaming too big, spreading myself too thin. My biggest mistake is I should have dreamed bigger, took more risk, done more acquisitions, more than 180 stuff, but it could have been more. And I think pushing myself stronger and pushing my team. So I would say actually not dreaming far enough, getting outside my comfort zone.
Yeah, Wan Ling, what do you think?
I think, you know, for biggest mistake, the one thing that disappoints me when sitting as a management, part of management is when board members really are not interested. Sometimes I wonder why they even sign up for some boards. I mean, like, I don't, you know, for what? It's sort of like, you know, I was shocked one day, like this gentleman who's been on our board, I'm not gonna say which company, but for 10 years, asked a very elementary question. And I'm like, you've been on this board for 10 years, because that doesn't help, you know, when this person goes and suggests something, we're like, well, what do you know? Right. So, but personally for me, it's sort of like, you know, in reflecting on the two boards, it's probably like what John said, being more aggressive, yeah.
So you were too cautious. You wish you'd thought bigger.
And if the first time your CEO takes a chance, you shoot him.
Yeah.
Then that's the last chance the CEO would take or their successor. So it's how do you get that balance? How do you create the environment?
And I'd love to get your take on that too.
Yeah, so one of the, it's making sure that I'm asking the right questions. As I become a more seasoned board member, if you will, I spend much more time making sure I understand the business, the industry. You know, I make sure I'm talking to customers, or I am a customer, right? If it's a business that's consumer oriented. So it's really getting more enmeshed in the business and not, I mean, we talked early on, like the, you know, governance is kind of table stakes, right? That's and the, you know, quarterly reporting and all that. That's table stakes, and you need to learn to move beyond that so you can be an effective board member and help.
Yeah.
Quick question, if I may,
Sure.
reverse it. What I'm trying to learn is I coach the young startups. It's vision and strategy, it's your leadership team, but it's culture. And we heard several of the earlier speakers talk about the culture. How does a board stay in touch with where the culture is, and how does it change? When I talk to my colleagues back at Hewlett-Packard, and I talk to the people when they fell from grace, and I asked the people who were at HP at that time, and including some of the prior CEOs, they said the board lost track of the culture. They didn't realize what had changed. How does a board listen to that, and how important do you all think it is?
I think culture is critically important, and I also think, though, that the management of the company, right,
I'm not going to split my
needs to own. It needs to own culture as well. I mean, a board can interact with executives. I always try and make a point of interacting not just with the senior team, but further down in the organization as well. So I think a board can certainly do that. They can certainly ask the questions, but I believe at the end of the day, you know, the management team, right, needs to own the culture. And if the board feels the management team's not doing it appropriately, then it's time for a change in the management team.
Let's get some. Do we get one over there on the panel? Yeah. Just let us know who you are. Oh.
Nathan Rosenberg from Insigniam. Wan Ling, just to coattail off of John's question, at Uber, after you fired the CEO or after the CEO resigned, depending on which story you read, what's been the role of the board in transforming the corporate culture? I mean, in a startup, the corporate culture is an extension of the founder's personality, and obviously that's not going to work going forward. So can you talk a little bit about the nuts and bolts of the board's role in transforming that culture?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's the Uber experience has been very interesting. Look, what is culture? Culture is very nebulous. It's something that, you know, to me, it's something you and I do when nobody else is watching. That's really culture. And so at Uber, and to me, the way you feel what the culture of the company is through the people you hire and through the people you promote. Do these people walk and talk? Yeah. You know, the culture of the company. And so we're in whether it's hiring new board members or hiring a new senior management, we always we express our sort of like, you know, our opinion, whether this person is what we want to see taking Uber forward from a culture standpoint.
Great. Anybody else? We got a question out here? We've got Adam, or we've got somebody else here other than Adam. Let's go.
Hi, I'm Bridget Fawcett from Citi, and I appreciate all of your comments. And interestingly, a lot of your perspectives comes from experience with technology companies. Obviously, there are a lot of people in this room who are from non-tech backgrounds. And I'm curious on a number of fronts, but one is, how do you see boards being disrupted going forward? And John, I'd ask you that question. If we think about 5 or 10 years from now, do we think boards will have the same construct that they do today? Number one. Number two, I'm also curious, within the ecosystem evolving, do we see ecosystem boards emerge? How do you think about that?
Great question.
The first question is no. The second question is it's a really good one. I'm going to have to think out a little bit longer. But to the point that you just made, I think it's an important takeaway for everybody in this room. Every company, doesn't matter if you're healthcare, manufacturing, even governments, is going to become a digital company, a digital country, et cetera. And the board members who can't change with that get left behind, and they've got to realize they do no one a service by that. However, the CEO, she or he, ought to spend time with bringing them up to speed, getting people regular, and ensuring that you have a good mix of some really good tech people who've been through the transitions and the wars, and I think more diversity in age has a huge amount to do with it. The ecosystem, the reason I hesitated is one of the things I'm doing in my startups different than everybody else is doing with theirs is I'm a coach, a mentor, a strategic partner with them, and I teach them how to build an ecosystem, and I bring my ecosystem to help them be successful, including taking them fishing to Alaska and teaching culture. Right. That would work in large boards. I'd never thought of it that way. How do you surround the board with an ecosystem where you have financial expertise that is unique that comes in and talks to you, security expertise, branding expertise, and how do you get your company to develop a replicatable playbook for crisis, for market disruption before it occurs, so you've already kind of played it through.
Yeah, the only thing when you think about the composition and the structure of the board, and today you hear a lot of boards talking about, do we need to add a digital director, right, to add that expertise? I mean, in my mind, 10 years from now, there won't be senior executives in companies who are not, it'll be a skill that everyone has to have. And so the idea that you have somebody who's the digital director, I think that has to fall away because everybody who's successful in a business career is just going to have to be digital.
It's always the kiss of death, like a company. If you say that's the digital officer and that's the innovation officer, sorry, you're in trouble already. You can't do it with a board either.
Yeah. We have a short minute and a half left. You've both been, all three of you rather, have been on both management side and the board side, the governance side. What one thing in a sentence would you like the managements to know that they should know about a good board, and what's the reverse? What should boards know about good managements? Go for it. What's one sentence?
I just think it's I think management needs to be appropriately open, right, about a board challenging, right, that whether management's being forward-looking enough. And I think boards need to make sure, right, through education or making sure that there's a diversity on the board that they're forward-looking enough.
Wanley?
Both sides need to be equally passionate about the business and the industry and really be curious about what's happening around them.
John?
I think that both sides have to realize the role is going to change dramatically, definitely in 10 and probably 5 years. You have to get used to a faster speed of change. You've got to work together in ways you haven't done before. And I like the ecosystem. I don't really have to think about that. I like saying, how do you get that to play in ways that haven't been done before? It's going to be exciting.
Fantastic. Love connecting the dots. This is John's book. You should read it. Thank you, John, Wanling, and thank you very much.